The cursed weapon had always been a topic of whispered rumors and dark legends. Soldiers, even those seasoned by countless battles, could not escape the fear that clung to it, an ancient artifact whose power was matched only by the devastation it wrought. For centuries, it had been passed from one empire to another, its true origins shrouded in mystery. It was said to possess a supernatural force, capable of turning the tide of war, but at a price. No one could deny that it was a weapon of unparalleled strength, one that could obliterate entire battalions in a matter of moments. But what made this weapon so feared was not just its power, it was the curse that seemed to accompany it. The first recorded sighting of the weapon occurred during the rise of a mighty kingdom in the ancient world. The kingdom was at war with its neighbors, engaged in a brutal struggle for dominance over vast territories. In the midst of this chaos, a king, desperate to secure victory, sought out a weapon that could tip the balance in his favor. It is said that he consulted with sorcerers, mystics, and warlords, all hoping to find something that would ensure his triumph. That was when the weapon was first revealed. A sword, forged from an unknown metal, with intricate markings along its blade, resembling runes of forgotten languages. The weapon had been buried deep within an ancient tomb, protected by powerful wards and traps that had kept it hidden for millennia. Legends spoke of the tomb as a place of death, where no one had ventured for fear of the horrors it contained. But the king, driven by a thirst for power, disregarded the warnings. He sent his bravest soldiers to retrieve the sword, offering them riches and glory in exchange for their service. Few returned, and those who did spoke of a chilling presence in the tomb, of shadows that seemed to move on their own, and a cold, unnatural aura that chilled them to the bone. Still, the king persisted, and eventually, the sword was brought into his possession. At first, the weapon seemed like a gift from the gods. Its sharpness was beyond belief, and it was light enough to be wielded with the speed of a dagger, yet it could cleave through armor and bone with ease. The king's soldiers marveled at its power and began to speak of it as a divine instrument, one that would secure their victory against all enemies. However, it wasn't long before the true nature of the weapon began to reveal itself. The first signs of the curse appeared after the weapon was used in battle. The king, eager to prove its worth, ordered it to be wielded in a great confrontation against a rival army. The battle was fierce, with both sides locked in a brutal struggle for survival. But as the cursed sword was drawn, a strange sensation filled the air, an almost suffocating stillness, followed by a wave of unease that rippled through the soldiers. Those who fought alongside the weapon felt its presence, a gnawing fear that lodged itself in their minds and hearts. The king himself, who had always been a strong and composed leader, began to feel the effects of the weapon. His hands shook as he gripped its hilt, his mind clouded by strange visions. He saw his enemies not as men, but as grotesque, monstrous figures, and each strike he made was filled with a bloodlust that he could not control. His soldiers, too, felt the change. Those who wielded the sword or even stood too close to it were struck by fits of madness, their eyes glazing over with a vacant, haunted expression. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse as the king's army, now consumed by a violent frenzy, began to butcher friend and foe alike. Despite their victory, the soldiers were unsettled by the weapon's effects. Those who had been closest to it found themselves haunted by nightmares, waking in cold sweats with visions of death and destruction. Some claimed to hear voices whispering in the dark, urging them to use the sword again, to strike down anyone who stood in their way. Others, who had been exposed to it for too long, simply went mad. The king, once proud and strong, began to unravel. He became paranoid, seeing traitors in every corner of his court. The weapon, which had once promised him dominance, now seemed to be a source of his unraveling mind. It wasn't long before the weapon's true curse became apparent. Those who touched it found themselves marked by a terrible fate. Some died suddenly, struck down by strange ailments that no healer could explain. Others suffered slow, agonizing deaths, their bodies twisting and contorting as if the weapon's curse was eating away at them from the inside. And those who survived, though they were physically intact, were left with minds scarred by the horrors they had witnessed and committed. The first to refuse the sword was a young captain, a soldier who had fought loyally for the king but had grown increasingly horrified by the weapon's influence. He had watched as his comrades fell to madness or death, and he knew that there was no way to stop it. In a moment of defiance, he threw the sword away, declaring that it was a tool of destruction that would lead them all to ruin. The king, in his rage, condemned the captain as a coward and a traitor, but there was no denying the truth in his words. The sword, despite its power, had brought only suffering and death. In the days that followed, whispers began to spread among the soldiers, some saying the weapon was cursed, others suggesting that it was a gift from the gods, but one with a terrible cost. Soon, the battlefield was divided, with some eager to wield the sword in search of victory and glory, while others refused, fearing the curse it carried. As the king's army continued its campaign, the weapon began to tear at the very fabric of the soldiers' loyalty. Factions formed, with some clinging to the belief that the weapon was their salvation, while others saw it as a harbinger of doom. The once unified force began to fracture under the weight of its own fears and superstitions. The tension within the ranks grew palpable, and the fear surrounding the cursed weapon became a shadow that loomed over every battle. Each skirmish was not just a contest of military might, but a struggle for the soul of the army. The soldiers could no longer fight as they once had, for they were torn between the power of the weapon and the fear it instilled in them. It was clear that something needed to be done to rid themselves of the cursed relic, but the question remained: could they find a way to destroy it before it destroyed them all? As the king's grip on his own sanity loosened, the soldiers were faced with an impossible choice: use the weapon and risk becoming slaves to its power, or cast it aside and risk losing the war. But with each passing day, the weapon's hold over them grew stronger, and the line between friend and foe began to blur. In the end, the weapon that had once promised them victory became their greatest enemy, a reminder that some powers were never meant to be controlled. The cursed sword, its history marked by death and madness, would forever haunt the soldiers who had once dared to wield it. The first time the cursed weapon was used in battle, its presence was felt long before it was drawn. The air itself seemed to grow thick with tension, and a chilling silence descended upon the battlefield. The soldiers, some of them seasoned veterans, could feel it, a strange unease that gnawed at their instincts. Whispers spread like wildfire, and even the fiercest among them could not ignore the dread that had taken root in their hearts. But the king, desperate for victory, had no time for fear. He ordered the weapon to be wielded in a decisive attack, believing it would turn the tide in their favor. The battle was one of the largest the kingdom had faced in years, a war of attrition that had stretched both sides to their limits. The enemy, a rival kingdom known for its strategic brilliance and ruthless warriors, had begun to push back the king's forces, gaining ground with each passing day. Morale was low. Soldiers who had once fought with the fervor of loyal patriots now looked upon their enemies with fear and doubt. In a desperate bid to break the deadlock, the king decided to unleash the weapon, the very artifact that had caused such unease among his commanders and soldiers. As the king's army lined up for battle, the cursed weapon was brought forward. The sword gleamed in the morning sunlight, its blade unlike any other, dark, almost obsidian in color, with faint markings along its length that seemed to move as though alive. The weapon itself felt unnatural, as though it had an aura of its own, a force that radiated power and fear. When it was placed in the hands of the king's greatest warrior, a man known for his strength and skill in battle, the air grew even heavier. The warrior, once full of confidence, looked at the weapon with hesitation, sensing something wrong but unable to voice his fears. The order was given, and the attack began. The initial charge was swift and brutal. The king's army, though outnumbered, had always been known for its discipline and ferocity. The soldiers fought with the precision of trained killers, their tactics honed through years of war. But the moment the warrior wielding the cursed weapon entered the fray, everything changed. The ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet, and with each strike of the sword, the enemy soldiers fell before him like wheat before the scythe. It was not the warrior's strength alone that caused such devastation, but the sword. Its power was beyond comprehension, its blade cutting through armor and flesh with unnatural ease. The first wave of the enemy was torn apart, but something strange began to happen. The warrior, his face twisted in a strange rapture, pressed forward with an almost manic energy as though possessed. His strikes became more erratic, more vicious. It was as if the weapon was guiding him, urging him to strike harder, faster, with more cruelty. His comrades, watching in awe and horror, could see the madness slowly taking hold of him. His eyes glazed over, his movements wild, as though the weapon itself was directing his every action. He no longer fought like a man, but like a beast, tearing through his enemies with a savagery that bordered on inhuman. The soldiers around him, who had once been filled with pride and determination, now began to feel a creeping sense of unease. They could see what was happening to the warrior, how the sword seemed to possess him, and they began to fear that the same fate awaited them. Some turned to look for a way out, others gripped their weapons tighter, but none of them could stop what was unfolding before them. As the king's army pressed on, the warriors who fought alongside the cursed blade were struck by an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the very act of wielding it was eroding their willpower. And then came the second phase of the battle, when the cursed weapon's influence reached its full, terrifying potential. As the king's army surged forward, the enemy began to retreat, but not without a fight. The cursed weapon, once thought to be a tool of destruction, now seemed to serve as an instrument of chaos. The battle devolved into a savage melee, where soldiers from both sides fought not just for survival, but for control of the weapon. Those who were closest to the warrior with the cursed blade found themselves drawn to it, as if its power had a magnetic pull. Some tried to wrest it from his grasp, others sought to strike him down and take it for themselves, believing that its power could be theirs if they could just lay their hands on it. The chaos intensified as the battle raged on, and the warrior, now fully consumed by the weapon, became a symbol of unstoppable destruction. But the more he wielded the blade, the more his body and mind seemed to deteriorate. His once strong frame was now gaunt, his face drawn and pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The curse had begun to take its toll on him, and yet he could not stop. The weapon had gripped him so tightly that even as he bled from numerous wounds, he continued to fight with an energy that defied reason. But it wasn't just the warrior who suffered. The soldiers fighting alongside him were affected too. Those who had previously shown no fear began to falter. They found themselves gripped by an overwhelming sense of dread, a darkness that seemed to cloud their thoughts and slow their movements. Some soldiers began to fall into fits of madness, shouting incoherently and attacking their own comrades. Others began to see visions, horrors that only they could perceive, making it impossible for them to focus on the battle at hand. The weapon, once seen as a tool to ensure victory, had become a force that shattered the unity of the king's army. In the midst of this madness, the king, who had been overseeing the battle from his tent, received word of the chaos unfolding on the battlefield. The reports were frantic, filled with tales of soldiers turning on one another, of men who had fought side by side for years now tearing each other apart. The king, once a man of firm resolve, now found himself questioning his decision to unleash the weapon. His mind raced with doubt, and his hands trembled as he ordered his commanders to pull back the army. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. As the sun began to set and the battlefield fell silent, the once proud army lay broken and scattered. The weapon, though still in the hands of the warrior, had taken more than just lives. It had taken the soul of the army itself. Those who had fought beside the cursed blade were now lost to madness, consumed by the horrors they had witnessed. The king, his heart heavy with guilt, knew that the victory had come at an unspeakable cost. The weapon had not only defeated the enemy but had destroyed everything in its path, leaving the soldiers in ruins, both physically and mentally. In the aftermath of the battle, the cursed weapon became a symbol of horror, a reminder of the darkness that had descended upon the king's army. Some whispered that the blade was more than just a weapon. It was a harbinger of doom, a tool of destruction that would claim all who dared to wield it. Others, those who had survived the battle, spoke of the strange compulsion they had felt to fight for the weapon, even as they witnessed its effects on their comrades. The weapon had taken hold of them in a way they could not explain, and now, it seemed to have cast a shadow over the entire kingdom. As the king's soldiers limped back to their camp, bruised and broken, they knew they had paid a terrible price for victory. The weapon, which had once promised them power and glory, had instead brought them madness and ruin. And though the enemy had been defeated, the true battle had only just begun. For the curse of the weapon had been unleashed, and it would haunt them all long after the last enemy had fallen. As the days passed after the battle, the true cost of the cursed weapon began to unfold. The victorious soldiers, once proud of their triumph, now found themselves haunted by something far worse than any enemy. It was not the physical wounds they had suffered on the battlefield that weighed most heavily on them, but the psychological toll of the weapon's influence. The soldiers who had been closest to the cursed blade felt its presence even after the battle had ended. It wasn't just that they had fought beside it. It was as though it had attached itself to them, burrowing into their minds and souls, a lingering poison that refused to let go. The first signs were subtle. A soldier who had once been known for his steady hand and sharp mind found himself suddenly stricken by fits of rage, attacking fellow soldiers over trivial matters. Another, who had always been calm in the face of danger, began to suffer from deep, unshakable paranoia. He would stare off into the distance for hours, muttering to himself about the weapon, convinced that it was watching him, whispering to him, urging him to do things he could not control. And then there were those who experienced horrific nightmares, waking in cold sweats, their bodies trembling from the terror they had experienced in their sleep. The weapon's curse had not ended with the battle, it had only just begun. For those who had been closest to the blade, the changes were even more drastic. The warrior who had initially wielded the weapon found himself racked with agony, both physical and mental. His body, once a paragon of strength and vitality, seemed to wither before his eyes. His hands shook uncontrollably, and his once keen senses became dulled, as though the weapon's curse was slowly draining him of his life force. His mind, too, began to unravel. He would lose hours of time, only to wake up in strange places, unable to recall how he had gotten there. His thoughts became jumbled, his memories blurred, and he could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was the product of his own tortured mind. As his condition worsened, the warrior became a shell of his former self. The other soldiers, once his comrades, now viewed him with a mixture of pity and fear. They could no longer look at him without seeing the madness in his eyes, the wild, frenzied look that had taken over him after he had touched the cursed weapon. The man who had once been their leader, their symbol of strength and courage, had become a tragic figure, a reminder of the weapon's terrible power. The whispers began almost immediately, as soldiers who had fought beside him began to question whether the curse had been passed on to them, whether it was only a matter of time before they too would succumb to its effects. The king, who had ordered the weapon's use in the first place, was not immune to the curse either. Though he had never directly wielded the sword, its influence had seeped into him as well. He had always been a man driven by ambition, by a desire to secure his legacy and ensure his kingdom's dominance. But now, with the war won and the weapon's terrible effects beginning to unfold, the king found himself torn between his desire for power and the creeping fear that the weapon had irrevocably changed him. He had once been a man of reason, able to make strategic decisions without hesitation. But now, he found himself plagued by doubts. His nights were filled with strange dreams, dreams of a dark figure whispering to him, urging him to take more risks, to push the boundaries of his power. The first time he attempted to speak to his council about the weapon's effects, he was met with disbelief. His generals, who had once followed him with unwavering loyalty, now seemed to look at him with growing suspicion. They had seen the changes in the army's behavior, the way the soldiers had become increasingly erratic, and they knew something had gone terribly wrong. But none of them dared to question the king outright, fearing that to do so would be seen as treason. And so, the tension in the court grew, with whispers of conspiracy and distrust festering just below the surface. The soldiers who had been exposed to the cursed weapon began to experience a kind of collective trauma. It was as though the curse was not only affecting the individuals who had wielded the weapon directly but was also spreading through the ranks. Even those who had not touched the sword found themselves grappling with its lingering influence. Some soldiers began to withdraw from their comrades, retreating into themselves as if haunted by visions that no one else could see. Others, unable to handle the mounting pressure, began to lash out at those around them. The once unified army was beginning to fracture, Its ranks split between those who believed the curse was real and those who dismissed it as mere superstition.